The first time I stepped into the house, something felt off. I know that sounds cliché, but I swear, the air inside felt heavier. It wasn't the new house smell most people talk about. Instead, it carried this faint, sour tang, like mildew mixed with something metallic. I chalked it up to the house being vacant for months. The place was a steel 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a spacious backyard. All for a price so low, I was almost too embarrassed to tell my friends. But hey, the market's wild, and I wasn't about to question my good luck. By the time the movers left, it was nearly 9 p.m. Boxes were piled in every corner, and exhaustion hit me like a truck. I hadn't even unpacked my kitchen, so I grabbed a frozen pizza and shoved it into the oven. While it baked, I started wandering through the house, taking it all in. That's when I noticed the door. It was at the end of the hallway, just past the laundry room. A heavy, old wooden door with this strange, circular lock. It looked completely out of place, as if it had been yanked out of an older building and slapped onto the frame. My realtor hadn't mentioned a basement, but here it was. My fingers traced the grain of the wood. There were scratches near the handle, deep grooves like someone had desperately tried to claw their way in or out. I laughed nervously. Probably just an old storm cellar, I told myself. Nothing weird about that. I didn't have a key for the lock, so I made a mental note to call the realtor in the morning. But as I turned to leave, something strange happened. A low thump came from the other side of the door. I froze. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, like a fist lightly hitting the wood. Thump. I leaned in closer, holding my breath. Maybe one of the movers had left a box in there? Or maybe the house had rats. Please let it just be rats, I thought. Hello, I called out, feeling ridiculous the moment the word left my mouth. Silence. I shook it off, chalking it up to settling noises or my overactive imagination. But as I walked back to the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the door wasn't just old. It was wrong. That night, the thumps started again. I'd been asleep for maybe an hour when I heard them echoing down the hallway. Thump thump. Not loud enough to wake the neighbors, but enough to send adrenaline spiking through my veins. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a flashlight, and crept down the hall, barefoot and trembling. The door loomed at the end of the hall, black against the dim glow of my night light. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, knowing full well it was locked. But when I touched it, it was warm. I yanked my hand back like the knob had burned me. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it would drown out the eerie silence in the hallway. The thumping had stopped, replaced by the faintest scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. Nope, I whispered to myself, backing away. Hell no. I forced myself to turn around and head back to my room. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe I was half dreaming. I locked my bedroom door, threw on some white noise, and tried to convince myself to sleep. But you know how it is, you can't unhear something like that. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside had me clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. I must have drifted off eventually, but my sleep was shallow and full of nightmares. I dreamt of that basement door, of hands clawing at the other side, of voices whispering my name. The next morning, the sunlight made me feel braver, or at least less ridiculous. I stood in front of the door again, coffee mug in hand, staring at the lock. I decided to text my realtor. Hey, quick question. Do you know what's behind the basement door? I didn't get a key for it. She replied almost immediately. The house doesn't have a basement. I frowned at the screen. What? I typed back. There's definitely a door at the end of the hallway. Maybe it's a storm cellar. Her next message made my stomach twist. There shouldn't be a door there. Can you send a pic? I snapped a photo and sent it. A few minutes passed, and then my phone rang. It was her. Listen, she said, her voice tight. I swear, that door wasn't there when we listed the house. I walked the property myself. What are you saying? I asked, my voice shaking. It just appeared? I don't know, she admitted. But I can call the previous owner and see if they know anything. In the meantime, maybe don't mess with it. Okay? I hung up, my head spinning. How could a door just appear? I paced the kitchen, trying to logic my way out of this. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. By the time evening rolled around, my nerves were shot. I kept hearing things. Faint knocks, soft murmurs, the occasional creak like someone was walking through the hall. I tried to ignore it, but by 9 p.m., the noise was constant. Thump thump, scratch, thump thump. It was coming from the door. Louder this time, more insistent. Okay, screw this, I muttered. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox I hadn't even unpacked yet and marched to the door. I wasn't about to be bullied by some creepy noises in my own house. As I stood there, hammer in hand, I noticed something strange. The scratches on the wood, they weren't random. They formed patterns, jagged lines and curves etched deep into the grain. My stomach churned as I realized they almost looked like letters. I leaned closer, tilting my head to read the marks. They spelled out 2 words, "Help me." My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, the hammer slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving an awful silence in its wake. And then the knob started to turn. The doorknob twisted slowly, almost lazily, like whatever was on the other side knew I was standing there, frozen in place. Couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body locked up, as if every ounce of self-preservation I had was telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. I stopped turning. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I swear I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, every breath I took echoing in the hallway. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the knob hadn't moved at all, and my lack of sleep was making me see things. Then came the whisper. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Help me." The voice was thin, cracked, like it hadn't been used in years. I staggered back, bumping into the wall as my brain screamed at me to do something, anything. But I couldn't stop staring at the door. It whispered again. This time it sounded closer. "Help me." I grabbed the hammer from the floor, my knuckles white around the handle. "Who's there?" My voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. I cleared my throat and tried again, louder. "Who's in there?" No response. I took a step closer, gripping the hammer like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. My other hand reached for the knob, trembling. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Someone trapped down there. Maybe a squatter who'd somehow been living in the basement? Or maybe just nothing. Nothing would be fine. I gripped the knob. It was cold now, ice cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. Slowly, I turned it. The lock clicked, but the door didn't budge. Something heavy was pressing against it from the other side. "Help me?" The voice said again, this time louder. It sounded more desperate. And then I heard something else. A faint, wet sound, like someone dragging their nails down a wall, or through something softer. "Okay," I muttered to myself, panic rising in my chest. "Okay, I'm getting help." I backed away, leaving the door half-turned, and grabbed my phone. I was done trying to handle this on my own. But when I unlocked my phone, it wouldn't work. The screen glitched, flickering between the home screen and static. Then the screen went black. I jabbed at the power button, but nothing happened. Dead. "Fine," I said through gritted teeth. "I'll get help the old-fashioned way." I headed for the front door, but when I reached it, I froze. The door wouldn't open. It wasn't locked, it just wouldn't move, as if something was holding it shut. I pulled harder, but it didn't budge. My skin crawled as I realized the air around me had grown colder. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, stretching toward me. From behind me, the thumping started again. Louder, harder, the sound of fists or something heavier, banging against the door. Thump, 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 and then it stopped. The voice came again, clearer this time, louder. "Open the door." I turned slowly, the hammer still in my hand. My whole body shook as I stepped back toward the hallway. The door looked the same as before, but now something was leaking out from beneath it. A dark, thick liquid that spread across the floor in slow, glistening rivulets. Blood. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. The smell hit me next, coppery and sharp, mixed with that sour tang I'd noticed on my first day here. It filled my nose, my lungs, and I gagged, covering my mouth with my free hand. "Open the door," the voice said again. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, commanding, and then the door shifted. Not opened, shifted. The wood seemed to ripple, bending inward like it was breathing. The scratches on its surface deepened, the grooves growing darker, more defined. The words, "Help me," disappeared, replaced by something new. "You too." The knob started to turn again, but this time, I wasn't going to stick around to see what happened next. I bolted down the hallway, slamming into the front door with my shoulder. It still wouldn't open. I turned and ran for the back door, but as I reached the kitchen, every cabinet flew open at once, slamming into the walls with deafening force. Dishes shattered, silverware spilled onto the floor, and the kitchen lights flickered wildly. "Let me out," I screamed, yanking at the back door. It wouldn't budge either. I pounded on it, desperate, but I knew I was trapped. The thumping started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from beneath me, from the floor. The thumping from beneath the floor was different this time, heavier, more deliberate. It wasn't just a random noise. It felt like a rhythm, like something was trying to send a message. Each impact made the tiles under my feet tremble, a hollow vibration echoing up through my legs. I backed away from the kitchen door, my hammer slick with sweat. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice cracking. No answer, just more thumping. Thump, 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 and then it stopped. The silence pressed in like a suffocating weight. I strained my ears, listening for anything that might give me a clue about what was happening. That's when I noticed it, the sound of breathing, slow, deep breaths, coming from right below me. I dropped to my knees and pressed my ear to the floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but no, it was real. The sound of something alive, something large, exhaling in long, drawn-out bursts. And then I heard the voice again, faint and echoing, like it was coming from far away. "Help me." I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the spot. My heel caught on a piece of broken plate, and I stumbled, catching myself on the counter. My mind raced. I needed to get out of this house, but every door, every window was sealed shut. It felt like the house itself had turned against me. My eyes flicked back to the floor. The tiles where I'd heard the breathing now looked wrong. The grout between them was darker, almost black, and it seemed to be spreading, like ink bleeding through paper. The air in the room grew colder, and that coppery, metallic smell grew stronger. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a knife from the counter and started prying at the tiles. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped it, but I kept going, wedging the blade into the gaps and pulling until the first tile popped free. What I saw underneath made my stomach lurch. It wasn't just the foundation or dirt, like I'd expected. The space beneath the tile was hollow, and instead of concrete, I saw something organic. It looked like flesh, pale, veined, and faintly pulsing, as if it were alive. The surface quivered slightly, and when I leaned closer, I realized the breathing sound was coming from it. I gagged, staggering back. The floor wasn't a floor, it was a thing, something alive. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." It sounded like it was coming from below the fleshy surface, muffled but desperate. Are you under there?" I stammered, the words feeling ridiculous as they left my mouth. There was no reply, but the breathing grew faster, more erratic. The tiles around the exposed patch started to crack, fractures spiderwebbing out like the house itself was crumbling. And then the thumping started again, harder this time, shaking the walls and rattling the broken dishes on the floor. Thump, thump, thump. I didn't know what I was doing anymore. Fear had taken over and logic was long gone. I swung the hammer at the fleshy patch as hard as I could. The first hit made it shudder violently, and a spray of thick, dark liquid burst from the wound. The smell that came with it was unbearable, like rotting meat and burning hair. I hit it again and again. Each swing made the hole bigger, revealing more of the pulsing, veined mass beneath. It was like something out of a nightmare, a living, breathing thing that had been hiding under my feet the entire time. And then, something moved. From the hole, a hand emerged. It was thin and skeletal, the skin stretched tight over the bones. The fingers twitched as if trying to grab onto something. "Nope. No. Nope," I muttered, backing away. But before I could take another step, the hand was joined by another. They clawed at the edges of the hole, pulling something up from the depths. What came out of that hole will haunt me for the rest of my life. It wasn't human. Not anymore, at least. Its skin was translucent, stretched over a body that was too long, too thin. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were deep black pits that seemed to drink in the light. Its mouth hung open, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. "Help me?" it rasped. But the voice didn't match the thing in front of me. It sounded like a recording, as if it were mimicking the cries of someone else. It crawled toward me, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. The smell hit me again, so strong I thought I might pass out. My back hit the wall, and I realized I had nowhere left to run. The creature dragged itself out of the hole, its body writhing and jerking as if it wasn't fully in control of its own movements. Its skin shimmered in the dim light, almost wet, and with every move it made, that sickening stench grew stronger. It locked those black, empty pits where eyes should have been directly on me. "Help me?" it rasped again, the voice thin and distorted, like an old tape being played too slow. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't asking for help. It was mocking me, repeating the words over and over like it was savoring them. I gripped the hammer tighter, my knuckles white. "Stay back," I screamed, swinging it wildly in front of me. The thing didn't flinch. It tilted its head like a curious animal, its mouth stretching wider into what I can only describe as a grotesque parody of a smile. Then it lunged. I swung the hammer as hard as I could, the head connecting with its shoulder. The impact made a sickening crunch, but the creature barely reacted. Its long, spindly fingers reached for me, and I bolted, adrenaline taking over. I stumbled out of the kitchen and down the hall, the floor beneath me trembling with every step. The thumping was back. Thump, 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 but now it was everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all vibrating with the same horrible rhythm. It felt like the house itself was alive, and it was trying to trap me inside. I made it to the living room, my eyes darting to the front door. It was still stuck, but I didn't care. I threw myself at it with everything I had, slamming my shoulder into the wood. The door groaned, the frame splintering slightly, but it held firm. Behind me, I heard the creature scraping across the floor. Its movements were faster now, more deliberate. The sound of its claws digging into the hardwood made my skin crawl. "Help me?" it howled, the voice louder now, echoing through the house. Only this time it wasn't alone. More voices joined in, dozens of them, all overlapping, crying out from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Men, women, children, all screaming the same thing. "Help me!" My vision blurred with tears as I threw myself against the door again, this time with a primal scream. The wood splintered further, and with one final shove, it burst open. I stumbled out onto the porch, falling hard onto the concrete steps. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and bracing. But the voices didn't stop. They followed me outside, pouring out of the open doorway in a deafening cacophony. And then, the thing crawled into the doorway, its body twisting unnaturally to fit through the frame. It hesitated, its head tilting as it stared at me. For a moment, I thought it might follow me. But then, it stopped. Its black, hollow eyes flicked upward, as if it was staring at something above me. The air grew colder. I turned my head just enough to catch a glimpse of my shadow on the porch, and that's when I saw it. There was something behind me, something tall and thin, its form warped and shifting, like smoke trapped in the shape of a person. Before I could move, the creature in the doorway shrieked, a horrible, guttural sound that made my ears ring. It backed away from the porch, retreating into the darkness of the house. The thing behind me didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't stick around to figure out what it was. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw myself inside, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I peeled out of the driveway without looking back. But even as I sped down the dark, empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that whatever I'd seen in that house wasn't done with me yet. Epilogue: I sold the house within a week, taking a huge financial hit just to get rid of it. The realtor didn't question me, but the way she avoided my eyes told me she knew something was wrong with that place. I've tried to move on, to pretend it was all some kind of hallucination brought on by stress or exhaustion. But every now and then, I wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, with the sound of that voice echoing in my head. Help me. And sometimes, when I walk past a dark hallway or a shadowy corner, I swear I see it. The thing. Watching. Waiting. I don't think it's done with me. Not yet. I wanted to believe it was over. After I sold the house, I moved into an apartment on the other side of town. Somewhere new, somewhere small, somewhere I could feel safe. But the thing about fear is it doesn't just stay in one place. It comes with you. It burrows into your mind, infects your thoughts, changes how you see the world. And I knew, deep down, that whatever I left behind in that house hadn't stayed there. The first sign came 3 nights after I moved into my apartment. I was lying in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. The hum of the city outside my window should have been comforting. But instead, every sound made me jump. A car horn, a dog barking, the muffled chatter of late-night pedestrians. It all felt wrong. Too loud, too close. Around midnight, the air shifted. It was subtle, but I felt it, like the temperature in the room had dropped a few degrees. My skin prickled, and a familiar smell hit me. Faint at first, but unmistakable. That same sour, metallic tang from the house. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. But in the corner, where the shadows pooled deepest, I thought I saw movement. Just a flicker so quick I almost missed it. Almost. I stared at the corner, my chest tight with dread. It's just your imagination, I whispered to myself. You're just paranoid. But even as I said it, I couldn't look away. The shadows shifted again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was there. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the corner. Nothing. Just an empty wall. I exhaled shakily, laughing at myself. You're losing it? I muttered, flopping back onto the bed. But as I turned off the flashlight, something stopped me cold. The corner was empty, but the wall wasn't. A single word was etched into the paint, faint but visible in the dim light. Help! The next few days were a blur of fear and denial. I kept telling myself it wasn't real. Maybe the apartment had been repainted, and the word had bled through from an old coat of paint. Or maybe I just imagined it altogether. But then other things started happening. The thumping came back. It wasn't loud, at first, just faint taps, like someone knocking lightly on the walls. But it grew louder, more persistent. It followed me from room to room, always just out of sight. And then there were the shadows. I'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye, dark, flickering shapes that disappeared when I turned my head. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The final straw came one night when I was washing dishes. My back was to the kitchen doorway, and the apartment was silent except for the sound of water running. I was rinsing a plate when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I froze, the plate slipping from my hands and shattering in the sink. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath hitching in my throat, and there it was. A figure stood in the doorway, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its body warped and shifting like smoke. Its black, empty eyes locked onto mine, and its mouth twisted into that awful, unnatural smile. "Help me," it whispered. I didn't scream, couldn't. My body refused to move, paralyzed by sheer terror. The figure tilted its head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air in the room shifted, the oppressive weight lifting as if it had never been there. But I knew better. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I started avoiding my apartment altogether, spending as much time as I could at work or in crowded places. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still with me. And then I found the letter. It was slipped under my apartment door, written on old, yellowed paper. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, like it had been scrawled in a hurry. It doesn't stop. It doesn't leave. It follows you until you give it what it wants. Burn the door. Destroy it. I stared at the letter, my hands trembling. Who had written this? How did they know? And most importantly, what door? And then it hit me. The basement door. The thought made me nauseous. I'd left that house behind. Someone else owned it now. But as I sat there, clutching the letter, I realized I didn't have a choice. If I wanted to end this, I had to go back. I had to face it. I didn't sleep the night before I went back to the house. How could I? Every nerve in my body was screaming not to go. But I knew if I didn't, it would follow me for the rest of my life. Whatever it was. By morning, I'd packed a bag, lighter fluid, matches, a crowbar, and the same hammer that had been my lifeline before. I wasn't going back to reason with whatever lived in that house. I was going back to end it. The drive felt longer than it should have. Every mile closer to the house made my chest tighten, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. When I finally pulled up to the property, I sat in the car for what felt like forever, staring at the house. It looked worse than I remembered. The paint was peeling, the windows were dirty, and the grass in the yard was overgrown. The for sale sign was gone, replaced by silence and that strange heaviness in the air. Someone else was supposed to have bought it, but it didn't look like anyone had moved in. I got out of the car, my legs shaky, and approached the front door. It wasn't locked. The knob turned easily, creaking open to reveal the same dim, suffocating interior I'd run from weeks ago. The air was thick with that coppery sour smell. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a quiet click. The house was silent, but the energy was oppressive. Every step felt like I was being watched. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. I made my way down the hallway, the bag heavy in my hand. And there it was, the basement door. It looked worse than before. More twisted, the wood warped as if it had been scorched and left to rot. The scratches were deeper, jagged, and raw. The words etched into it now read, "You can't stop us." My stomach churned, but I didn't hesitate. I dropped the bag, pulled out the crowbar, and jammed it into the frame. "You don't get to win," I muttered through gritted teeth, prying at the wood. It groaned under the pressure but held firm. Then the thumping started. It came from behind the door, shaking the floor beneath me. The walls trembled, the lights flickered, and a deep, guttural moan echoed through the house. But I didn't stop. I pulled harder, my muscles screaming, until the frame finally gave way. The door burst open, slamming against the wall, and the smell that poured out was unbearable. Decay and rot, so thick I gagged. The stairs led down into darkness, but the moment the door opened, I saw them, hands. Pale, bony hands reaching out from the shadows, clawing at the steps, the walls, each other. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, and from the depths, a voice rumbled, deep, distorted, and angry. "Leave." I ignored it. I grabbed the lighter fluid and began pouring it over the door, the frame, and the top of the stairs. The hands recoiled, twitching and jerking, as if they could feel what was coming. The voice screamed again, louder this time, shaking the whole house. "You can't win. Watch me," I said, striking a match. The flame caught quickly, climbing the wood in an instant. The fire spread down the frame and into the darkness below, illuminating the horror I hadn't fully seen before. The walls weren't just wood or concrete, they were made of flesh. Twisting, pulsing flesh, covered in veins and stretched faces, their mouths open in silent screams. The hands clawed desperately at the flames, trying to extinguish them, but it was too late. The fire roared, consuming everything. The screams that came from the basement weren't human. They were something else, something ancient and wrong, and they filled my head until I thought my skull might crack. I stumbled back, the heat pushing me toward the front door. As I ran, the fire spread, climbing the walls and racing across the ceiling. The house was burning, but it wasn't going quietly. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as they tried to block my path. But I didn't stop. I pushed through, crashing out the front door just as the flames reached the roof. I collapsed in the yard, gasping for air, as the house roared behind me. The fire lit up the night, and for a moment I thought I heard voices, dozens of them screaming and then laughing. And then it was silent. I sat there until the fire department arrived, watching the house burn to the ground. They asked me what happened, but I couldn't explain. What was I supposed to say? That the house was alive? That something evil had been living beneath it? They wouldn't have believed me. Hell, I barely believed it myself.